The city was alive with energy, its streets buzzing with people rushing to their destinations. Skyscrapers towered above, casting long shadows over the sidewalks as cars honked impatiently in traffic. It was a place where diversity thrived. People from all walks of life called it home. But beneath the surface of this vibrant metropolis lay cracks that couldn't be ignored. Racial tensions simmered quietly, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite them. Detective Marcus Johnson had spent years climbing the ranks within the police department. He was no stranger to hard work or challenges. Born and raised in the same city he now served, Marcus knew its heartbeat better than anyone else. His dedication earned him respect from many, but not everyone welcomed his rise to power. When he was appointed as the new police chief, a first for a black officer in the department's history, it sent ripples through the precinct. Some officers admired his leadership and vision, while others resented him simply because of who he was. Among those who disliked Marcus was Officer Brian Collins, a veteran cop with a reputation for being hot-headed. Collins prided himself on doing things his way. To him, Marcus represented everything wrong with modern policing. He saw him as someone who got ahead not because of skill, but because of quotas and political correctness. Collins wasn't shy about voicing his opinions either. In the locker room, during coffee breaks, or even in casual conversations, he dropped snide remarks about Marcus. Affirmative action hire, he'd mutter under his breath, rolling his eyes whenever Marcus's name came up. But Marcus didn't let these whispers get to him. He had faced worse growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce. Instead, he focused on leading by example, determined to prove that he deserved the badge just as much as anyone else. Still, there were moments when the weight of prejudice pressed down on him. Late at night, sitting alone in his office, Marcus would stare at the framed photo of his family on his desk. It reminded him why he kept pushing forward, to create a safer world for them, and others like them. Meanwhile, Collins grew increasingly bitter. He felt overlooked and unappreciated, convinced that the department cared more about appearances than actual results. This resentment festered until it consumed him, turning into something darker. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Collins sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced with thoughts of injustice, or what he perceived as injustice. Little did he know, fate was about to bring him face to face with the very person he despised most. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, neither Marcus nor Collins realized how drastically their lives were about to change. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose deep-rooted biases and challenge the fragile trust between law enforcement and the community. What happened next would leave an indelible mark, not only on their lives, but on the entire city they lived in. It was one of those quiet evenings where the city seemed to pause for a moment, the hum of traffic easing into a gentle rhythm. Detective Marcus Johnson had just wrapped up a long day at the precinct. His mind was still replaying the details of the high-profile case he closed earlier, a victory that had earned nods of approval from his superiors and gratitude from the community. But now, with the weight of the day lifting, Marcus was finally heading home. The streets were familiar, lined with the same buildings and streetlights he'd passed countless times before. He drove his sedan carefully, obeying every rule of the road. It wasn't unusual for him to leave work late, but tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the calm after the storm of the past few weeks, or maybe it was just the relief of knowing he could finally relax. Whatever it was, Marcus didn't notice anything out of the ordinary until the flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, Marcus frowned, confused. He glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His headlights on, seatbelt fastened. Everything seemed in order. Still, the lights grew brighter as the vehicle behind him slowed down. Reluctantly, Marcus signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. He rolled down his window, letting the cool night air drift into the car. As he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cop car stopped a few feet behind him, But instead of stepping out immediately, the officer lingered inside for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the door opened and the figure emerged. Even in the dim glow of the streetlight, Marcus recognized him instantly. Officer Brian Collins. Off duty, no less. Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew about Collins, the whispered complaints, the thinly veiled hostility. But this was unexpected. Why would an off-duty officer pull someone over? Collins approached the car with deliberate steps, his posture stiff and aggressive. His eyes narrowed as they met Marcus's through the open window. For a brief second, there was silence, broken only by the distant sound of tires rolling on asphalt. Then Collins spoke, his voice sharp and accusatory. "License and registration," he demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. Marcus remained calm, though his heart began to race. "Officer, is there a reason I was stopped?" he asked politely, reaching for his wallet. That's when Collins's demeanor shifted. His jaw clenched, and his lip curled slightly as recognition dawned. "Oh, it's you," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Didn't think I'd see you out here tonight." Marcus froze momentarily. There was something in Collins's voice that sent a chill down his spine. He handed over his license and registration, explaining calmly, "I'm Chief Marcus Johnson. I've been working late at headquarters. Is there a problem?" But Collins wasn't listening. Instead, he stared at the documents, then back at Marcus, his expression hardening further. "Chief, huh?" he sneered, his voice rising slightly. "Guess that doesn't mean much when you're breaking the law." Marcus blinked, taken aback. "Breaking the law? Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. You can check my record if you'd like." Collins ignored him, pacing around the car like a predator circling its prey. His movements were erratic, fueled by anger, or perhaps something deeper. Marcus watched him carefully, trying to stay composed. Something about this situation felt personal, and as the seconds ticked by, Marcus realized this wasn't going to end quickly or easily. Unbeknownst to either of them, passers-by had begun to slow down, curious about the scene unfolding on the side of the road. Phones were already out, capturing video footage. The tension between the two men crackled in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. What started as a routine traffic stop was rapidly spiraling into something far more dangerous, and neither man could have predicted the consequences that awaited them both. The tension between Marcus and Collins continued to escalate, each passing second stretching longer than the last. Collins stood beside Marcus's car, gripping the documents Marcus had handed over with unnecessary force, as if trying to crush them in his fist. His eyes darted back and forth between the papers and Marcus, his expression darkening with every glance. "Breaking the law," Collins muttered under his breath again, shaking his head as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing, or maybe just looking for an excuse to justify his actions. "You think your badge makes you special, that you're above everyone else." Marcus remained calm, though his pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he knew losing his composure wouldn't help. Instead, he spoke slowly, deliberately, choosing his words carefully. "Officer Collins, I'm not breaking any laws. You can verify that with dispatch. This is a misunderstanding." But Collins wasn't interested in explanations. His face twisted into a sneer, and he leaned closer to the window, invading Marcus's personal space. "A misunderstanding? Don't give me that nonsense. You people always play the victim card when things don't go your way." Marcus stiffened at the comment, his jaw tightening. The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with meaning. It wasn't the first time he heard it, but hearing it now from another officer stung more than he cared to admit. Still, he forced himself to stay focused. Arguing wouldn't solve anything, especially not here, not like this. "You're out of line, officer," Marcus said firmly, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside him. "If you have an issue with my conduct, take it up through proper channels. But this isn't how we handle things." Collins scoffed, throwing his hands up in mock frustration. "Proper channels? Oh, right. Because that'll actually work. Everyone knows they bend over backward for you." Before Marcus could respond, Collins straightened abruptly, his hand moving toward his holster. Time seemed to slow as Marcus watched the motion, dread pooling in his stomach. Was he really about to draw his weapon? Over a traffic stop. And then it happened. Collins pulled out his gun, pointing it directly at Marcus through the open window. The cold metal gleamed ominously in the dim light, its presence impossible to ignore. Marcus froze, his mind racing. He raised his hands instinctively, palms open and visible, showing he posed no threat. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let fear take control. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter now, laced with disbelief. "There's no need for this." But Collins didn't lower the gun. If anything, his grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Don't tell me what I need," he snapped, his voice rising sharply. "You think you can just waltz around, acting like you own the place. Well, guess what? I'm still in charge here." Passers-by who had slowed down to watch the scene began shouting from their cars. Some yelled warnings to Collins, telling him to put the gun away. Others recorded the incident on their phones, capturing every detail, the angry glare in Collins's eyes, the way Marcus sat perfectly still, his hands raised in surrender. The videos would later spread across social media, sparking outrage and debate. But for now, the focus was entirely on the two men locked in this tense standoff. Marcus kept his gaze fixed on Collins, searching for any sign of reason or restraint. "This isn't who you are," he said softly, almost pleadingly. "You're better than this." But Collins wasn't listening. His breathing was ragged, his anger unchecked. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. All that existed was the barrel of the gun and the invisible divide between the two men. And while Marcus remained outwardly composed, inwardly he braced himself for whatever came next. He knew one wrong move, one misstep, and the situation could turn deadly. As the seconds dragged on, the gravity of the moment settled heavily over both men. Marcus realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. The choices made here, tonight, would ripple far beyond the confines of this quiet street. And as the crowd grew louder, demanding answers, Marcus understood that the real test wasn't whether he survived this encounter. It was whether justice would prevail in its aftermath. The sound of raised voices and the flashing red and blue lights drew more attention than either Marcus or Collins could have anticipated. Cars slowed down further, some stopping completely as drivers craned their necks to see what was happening. Pedestrians gathered on the sidewalk, pointing and whispering among themselves. Phones were held high, recording every word, every movement, every second of the confrontation unfolding before them. Among the growing crowd was a young woman named Hasha, who had been walking her dog when she noticed the commotion. Her hands trembled slightly as she filmed the scene, her phone capturing Collins's gun pointed squarely at Marcus. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, an off-duty officer threatening a police chief, someone who was supposed to be his superior. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath, her voice shaky but determined. "People need to see this." Others in the crowd echoed her sentiment. A man standing nearby shouted, "Hey, put the gun down. What are you doing? He hasn't done anything." Another added, "You're out of control. Man, this isn't right." The chorus of disapproval grew louder, creating an almost deafening wall of noise. Some yelled directly at Collins, while others called for someone, anyone, to step in and de-escalate the situation. But Collins seemed oblivious to the chaos around him. His focus remained entirely on Marcus, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. Sweat trickled down his temple, and his breathing came in short, uneven bursts. The weight of the moment, the gravity of what he was doing, didn't appear to register with him. Instead, he barked back at the crowd, his voice sharp and defensive. "Mind your own business. You don't know what's going on here." Marcus, meanwhile, stayed eerily calm. He didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle except to keep his hands raised. His eyes locked onto Collins's, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt. But all he saw was rage, a storm of anger and prejudice that refused to subside. Still, Marcus refused to let fear dictate his actions. He spoke again, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside him. "Officer Collins, think about what you're doing. This isn't how we resolve things." Collins sneered, tightening his grip on the gun. "Don't lecture me, Johnson. I've had enough of your lectures." Before either man could say another word, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. Backup had arrived. Sergeant Linda Hayes, a veteran officer known for her no-nonsense approach, stepped out of her patrol car, her hand resting on her holstered weapon as she assessed the situation. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw Collins aiming his gun at Marcus. Without hesitation, she approached the scene, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Collins, stand down. Now." Her command caught Collins off guard, and for a split second, his aim faltered. But he quickly recovered, snapping back at her. "Stay out of this, Hayes. This doesn't concern you." "It absolutely concerns me," Linda shot back, her tone firm and unyielding. "You're pointing a loaded weapon at the police chief. Lower your gun, or I swear to God, you'll regret it." The tension between the three officers crackled in the air, thick and suffocating. Linda's presence brought a new dynamic to the situation, forcing Collins to reconsider his next move. But even as he hesitated, the damage had already been done. Dozens of phones captured the entire incident, and within minutes, snippets of the video began circulating online. Social media platforms lit up with reactions, hashtags spreading like wildfire. Hashtag Justice for Marcus. Hashtag Accountability Now. Hashtag End Policieracism. Back at the scene, Linda continued to press Collins, her patience wearing thin. "This ends now. Put the gun down, or I'll call for backup to disarm you myself. Your choice." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective outrage palpable. Collins glanced around, finally realizing the magnitude of what he'd done. For the first time since pulling over Marcus, doubt flickered across his face, but pride, or perhaps stubbornness, kept him rooted in place. He lowered the gun slightly but didn't holster it, his defiance still evident. As the standoff dragged on, Marcus remained silent, acutely aware that the spotlight was no longer just on him. It was on the entire department. Every decision made in the next few moments would shape public perception and trust in law enforcement. And deep down, he knew that justice wasn't just about punishing Collins. It was about proving that accountability existed, even within the ranks of those sworn to protect and serve. With Linda's arrival, the tide began to shift. The crowd's cheers grew louder, urging Collins to stand down. The pressure mounted, and for the first time, it felt like there might actually be a resolution, one that could hold a mirror to the systemic issues plaguing the force and society as a whole. By the time the dust had settled at the scene, the city was already buzzing with news of the confrontation. Social media timelines were flooded with videos and screenshots from the incident, each post adding fuel to the fire of public outrage. People couldn't stop talking about it. How an off-duty officer had drawn his weapon on the police chief, how the situation had spiraled out of control in plain view of bystanders. The images of Collins pointing his gun at Marcus were everywhere, impossible to ignore. Within hours, the police department launched an internal investigation. This wasn't just a matter of protocol. It was a necessity. The pressure from the public was immense, with calls for accountability coming from all corners. Community leaders, activists, even local politicians. The mayor herself issued a statement condemning the incident and promising transparency. "This is not who we are as a city," she declared during a hastily arranged press conference. "We will get to the bottom of this, and we will hold those responsible accountable." The investigation moved quickly. Investigators pored over the footage captured by bystanders, analyzing every frame to piece together exactly what had happened. They also reviewed body camera recordings from officers who had arrived later, including Sergeant Linda Hayes. her testimony proved crucial. She described Collins's erratic behavior, his refusal to comply with orders, and his blatant disregard for procedure. It was reckless, she told investigators firmly. He crossed a line, and he knew it. Collins, meanwhile, found himself in hot water. Stripped of his firearm temporarily and placed on administrative leave, he was called in for questioning. Sitting across from the investigators, he remained defiant, doubling down on his actions. When asked why he had drawn his weapon, he claimed self-defense, arguing that Marcus had made him feel threatened, even though there was zero evidence to support that claim. "He challenged my authority," Collins insisted, his voice laced with bitterness. "I wasn't going to let him walk all over me." But the footage told a different story. Video after video showed Marcus remaining calm and cooperative throughout the encounter, his hands raised in surrender while Collins escalated the situation unnecessarily. Investigators also noted the racial undertones in Collins's language, the loaded phrases like "you people" that betrayed his prejudice. It became clear that this wasn't just about a disagreement or a misunderstanding. It was about bias and hostility boiling over into dangerous territory. As the investigation unfolded, so did the backlash. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying the voices demanding justice. Protesters gathered outside the police headquarters, holding signs that read "No justice, no peace," and chanting slogans calling for reform. Community members shared their own experiences of discrimination within the department, painting a picture of systemic issues that went far beyond one bad apple. Inside the precinct, tensions ran high. Officers whispered among themselves, some defending Collins while others criticized him openly. For many, the incident forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about racism and bias within their ranks. Even those who hadn't personally harbored prejudice realized they had perhaps turned a blind eye to it in the past. The divide grew wider, but so did the conversations. Difficult, raw, and necessary. Finally, after days of gathering evidence and testimonies, the investigators reached their conclusion. Collins's actions were deemed unjustified and egregious, a violation of department policies and ethical standards. His refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing sealed his fate. In a closed-door meeting with senior officials, it was decided unanimously. Brian Collins would be terminated immediately. His badge and credentials were revoked, effective at once. When the decision was announced publicly, the reaction was mixed. Many celebrated it as a victory for accountability, proof that no one, not even a police officer, was above the law. Others expressed frustration, arguing that firing Collins wasn't enough. "This isn't just about one man," said a local activist during a televised interview. "This is about addressing the deeper issues that allowed someone like him to stay in power for so long." For Marcus, the outcome brought a sense of relief, but not closure. He understood that Collins's termination was only the first step toward real change. As he sat in his office later that evening, scrolling through the flood of messages he'd received from supporters and critics alike, he felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about the future of policing, the trust between the community and law enforcement, and the hard work needed to bridge the gap. And Marcus knew, deep down, that the fight was far from over. The news of Officer Brian Collins's termination spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and conversations across the city. For many, it was a moment of vindication, a rare instance where justice seemed swift and decisive. Social media erupted with reactions, some celebrating the decision as a step forward, while others questioned whether it was enough to address the deeper issues at play. Despite the public outcry and widespread attention, Marcus Johnson found little solace in the outcome. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. His wife, Angela, had tried to comfort him earlier, but even her reassuring words couldn't fully ease the storm brewing inside him. He replayed the incident over and over in his mind. The flashing lights, Collins's sneer, the cold glint of the gun pointed at him. It wasn't just the fear or anger that lingered. It was the realization that this could have ended so differently. What if Collins hadn't hesitated? What if someone else had been in his place? Angela returned to the living room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She handed one to Marcus and sat beside him, her expression soft but concerned. "You've been through a lot," she said gently. "Are you okay?" Marcus sighed, staring into the mug without taking a sip. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I keep thinking about what happened, about how close it came to something worse." He paused, searching for the right words. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who looks like me, who has to deal with this kind of thing every single day." Angela nodded, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You're not alone in this. People see what happened, and they're standing with you. But I know it's heavy. You've carried this burden for a long time." She was right. Marcus had spent years navigating spaces where he was often the only black person in the room, proving himself time and again despite the odds stacked against him. This incident wasn't new. It was just another chapter in a story he'd been writing his whole life. But this time, it felt different. The world was watching, and expectations were high. Everyone looked to him to lead, to guide, to fix what was broken. And while he wanted nothing more than to rise to the challenge, he couldn't ignore the toll it took on him personally. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the precinct early, steeling himself for the inevitable questions and stares. Word of Collins's firing had reached the department, and the atmosphere was tense. Some officers avoided eye contact, embarrassed or ashamed by their colleagues' actions. Others approached Marcus cautiously, offering apologies or expressions of support. Sergeant Linda Hayes was among them. "Chief," she said, her voice sincere, "if there's anything I can do, let me know. We're behind you." Marcus appreciated the gesture, though he knew rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy. He called a meeting with his senior staff, determined to address the elephant in the room. Standing before them, he spoke candidly about the incident, not just the specifics of what happened, but its broader implications. "This isn't about one bad officer," he said, his tone measured but firm. "It's about recognizing the biases and prejudices that exist within our system, and doing everything in our power to root them out." His words resonated with some, but not all. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truths Marcus laid bare. Still, he pressed on, outlining plans for mandatory bias training, increased community engagement, and stricter accountability measures. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but Marcus was committed to starting the process. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus threw himself into his work, channeling his emotions into action. He met with community leaders, listened to their concerns, and promised transparency moving forward. He also made time to visit schools and neighborhood meetings, sharing his vision for a safer, fairer city. Each interaction reminded him why he became a police officer in the first place: to serve and protect, to make a difference. But even as progress began to take shape, Marcus couldn't shake the emotional scars left by the encounter. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed distant, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The fear, the frustration, the exhaustion, all of it bubbled to the surface. Yet, amidst the pain, there was also hope that the incident would spark real change, hope that his efforts would inspire others to join the fight for justice. For Marcus, the road ahead was daunting, but he refused to back down. He knew the battle against prejudice and inequality would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it head-on. After all, he had always believed in the power of resilience and in the possibility of a brighter future. Weeks turned into months, and the city began to settle into a new rhythm. The initial shock of the incident had faded, but its impact lingered like ripples in a pond, touching lives far beyond Marcus Johnson and Brian Collins. For Marcus, the emotional scars ran deep. While he had thrown himself into his work, determined to channel the pain into purpose, there were quiet moments when the weight of it all pressed down on him. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation in his mind. Days when the stares or whispered comments from colleagues reminded him that not everyone supported his vision for change. Despite the challenges, Marcus refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he leaned on those closest to him, his wife Angela, his trusted mentor Sergeant Linda Hayes, and a growing circle of allies within the department who shared his commitment to reform. Together, they worked tirelessly to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. It wasn't easy. Some residents were skeptical, their faith in the police shattered by years of neglect and injustice. Others were outright hostile, unwilling to forgive past wrongs. But Marcus understood their anger. He didn't ask for blind trust. He asked for patience and partnership. One of Marcus's first initiatives was launching a series of town hall meetings across the city. These weren't your typical bureaucratic gatherings where officers spoke at length while citizens listened silently. No, Marcus wanted dialogue. Real, honest conversations about fear, frustration, and hope. At one meeting in a predominantly black neighborhood, an elderly woman stood up, her voice trembling as she recounted how her grandson had been unfairly profiled during a traffic stop. "I'm scared for him every time he leaves this house," she said, tears streaming down her face. "How can I trust you to keep him safe?" The room fell silent, every eye on Marcus. He took a deep breath before responding. "Ma'am, I can't undo what's already been done. And I can't promise that we'll never make mistakes again. But I can promise you this: we're listening, we're learning, and we're going to do better, for your grandson, for you, and for everyone who calls this city home." His words weren't perfect, but they were heartfelt. Slowly, hesitantly, the crowd began to open up. People shared stories of loved ones lost to police violence, of feeling invisible in their own neighborhoods. Officers in attendance listened intently, some visibly moved by the raw emotion in the room. By the end of the evening, tentative connections had formed, small steps toward healing. In addition to these community efforts, Marcus spearheaded major changes within the department itself. Mandatory bias training became a cornerstone of the new policy, designed not just to check boxes but to foster genuine understanding. Role-playing scenarios challenged officers to confront their own prejudices, forcing them to see situations from perspectives they might otherwise overlook. Marcus also introduced body cameras for every officer, ensuring transparency and accountability in every interaction. But perhaps his boldest move was creating a civilian oversight board, a group of community members empowered to review complaints against officers and recommend disciplinary actions. This decision drew criticism from some within the department, who argued it undermined their authority. "We're being treated like criminals," one officer grumbled during a staff meeting. But Marcus held firm. "If we want the public to trust us, we have to show them we're willing to be held accountable," he explained. "This isn't about punishment. It's about progress." As the reforms took shape, Marcus noticed subtle shifts in the department's culture. Conversations once avoided were now happening openly. Younger officers, eager to prove themselves as agents of positive change, embraced the new policies with enthusiasm. Even seasoned veterans, initially resistant, began to see the value in adapting to a rapidly changing world. Still, Marcus knew the journey was far from over. There would always be setbacks, moments when doubt crept in or resistance flared. But he found strength in the small victories: a handshake from a former critic, a child waving hello instead of running away, a community event filled with laughter rather than tension. Each triumph fueled his determination to keep pushing forward. Late one evening, as he sat in his office reviewing reports, Marcus glanced at the framed photo of his family on his desk. His daughter smiled back at him, her bright eyes full of innocence and promise. She represented everything he fought for: a future where no child had to grow up afraid of those sworn to protect them. With renewed resolve, Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet hum of the precinct wash over him. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. Months had passed since the incident with Brian Collins, And the city was beginning to feel different. Not perfect, far from it, but there was a sense that something was shifting, however slowly. Detective Marcus Johnson stood at the podium in front of a packed auditorium, his presence commanding yet calm. The room buzzed with anticipation as reporters, community members, and fellow officers waited for him to speak. This wasn't just another press conference. It was a moment to reflect on how far they'd come and how much further they still had to go. Marcus began by acknowledging the pain and anger that had fueled so many protests and conversations over the past year. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said, his voice steady but warm. It takes courage, patience, and persistence. But I'm proud to say that our city has taken important steps toward becoming a place where everyone feels safe and respected. He highlighted the progress they'd made. The implementation of body cameras, which had already led to greater transparency in police interactions. The formation of the Civilian Oversight Board, which had reviewed dozens of cases and fostered trust between law enforcement and the community, and the new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. These weren't just policies written on paper. They were tools being used daily to reshape the way officers approached their work. But Marcus didn't shy away from addressing the challenges that remained. He spoke candidly about resistance within the department, about officers who still clung to old habits and attitudes. Not everyone is on board, he admitted. Some see these changes as threats rather than opportunities. But we can't let fear or pride stand in the way of doing what's right. If we want to earn back the public's trust, we have to be willing to evolve. As he spoke, Marcus scanned the crowd, making eye contact with people from all walks of life. He saw nods of agreement, murmurs of encouragement, and even a few skeptical expressions. That was okay. He didn't expect universal approval. What mattered was that people were listening, engaging, and holding each other accountable. After the speech, Marcus stepped down from the podium and mingled with attendees. A young boy approached him, tugging on his sleeve. "Are you really the chief?" the child asked, wide-eyed. Marcus knelt down to meet him at eye level. "Yes, I am," he replied with a smile. "And what's your name?" "Ely," the boy said proudly. "My mom says you're trying to make things better." Marcus chuckled softly. "Well, I'm doing my best. Maybe one day you'll help too." The encounter stayed with Marcus long after the event ended. It reminded him why he kept fighting, not for recognition or praise, but for moments like this, when hope felt tangible, even if fleeting. Later that evening, as he drove home through the same streets where everything had changed months ago, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about Brian Collins, whose actions had exposed deep wounds, but also ignited a movement for reform. He thought about the countless individuals who had shared their stories, demanding to be heard. And he thought about the future, a future where no one would have to endure what he did that night. When he arrived home, Angela greeted him at the door, wrapping him in a tight hug. "How did it go?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "It went well," Marcus said, pulling her close. "But it's not about me. It's about us, all of us working together." That night, as he tucked his daughter into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy, are you a hero?" she asked innocently. Marcus smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone trying to do the right thing, just like everyone else should." As he turned off the light and closed her bedroom door, Marcus felt a quiet sense of peace. The road ahead would be long, winding, and unpredictable. There would be obstacles, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But tonight, standing here in the warmth of his home, surrounded by love and purpose, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He was exactly where he was meant to be. And so was the city, inching closer to a brighter, more equitable future, one step at a time.